"Arthur Piercy, you're under arrest." Those were the first words that registered after I'd been knocked to the ground. My arms were wrenched behind my back, and the handcuffs were so tight, I thought my hands might fall off. I had simply opened the front door, but the second I did, at least 4 cops charged in and knocked me flat. They yanked me to my feet roughly as a few more people, dressed in regular suits, strolled into the house. "Mr. Piercy, this is a warrant to search your property," one of the men, gray-haired and stern, said, thrusting a piece of paper in my face. "Get him out of here." "Wait," I shouted, struggling against the hands clamping down on me. "There's got to be some mistake." But before I could even finish, I was spun around hard and slammed into the doorframe. My glasses flew off and I was seeing stars. "That's resisting arrest, pervert," growled the officer who had slammed me into the frame. "Enough," warned the first guy, though his tone didn't really suggest he cared much. "Just get him processed." My mind was racing as they threw me into the back of a squad car like a piece of trash. All I could think about were my kids, Melanie, who's 12, and Tom, 11. The cop who had smashed me against the doorframe slid into the driver's seat, buckled up, and we were off, leaving my house behind. "Listen," I said, trying to sit up in the back seat despite the pain shooting through my wrists. "My kids are going to be home from school soon. I need to. You don't need anything except to shut your big, fat mouth." The cop snarled, cutting me off. "These are my kids," I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. That's when he slammed on the brakes. I had been going about 35 miles per hour when my body hit the metal grill that separated me from the front seat. Physics doesn't lie. An object in motion stays in motion until it slams into something solid. The cop twisted around in his seat, glaring at me. "Say one more word, scumbag, and I'll come back there and beat you to death. And by the way, my body cam's off." I had barely managed to turn my head, so my nose wasn't shattered, but my cheek was already swelling. I stayed silent for the rest of the ride. When we finally reached the station, the officer locked up his gun, then dragged me out of the car and into the booking area. A female officer was waiting there, completely unfazed by my condition. "Paperwork?" she asked as the officer tossed her a folder. "What happened to him?" she asked, glancing my way, though she didn't seem particularly concerned. "Resisting arrest," the officer said as he slapped leg irons on me. She just shrugged like it was another day on the job. I couldn't help but sigh in relief when she finally took the cuffs off my wrists. After the usual mug shots and fingerprinting, she started rattling off questions. "Height, 6 feet, I answered. "Weight, 210, I said. "Charges, I have no idea," I said, feeling more frustrated by the second. "No one's told me anything." With an exasperated sigh, she flipped through the paperwork she'd been handed. I watched as her face turned pale, then bright red. Without a word, she stormed over to one of the cells, flung the door open, and pointed inside. "Can I at least make a phone call first?" I asked. She nodded at a phone on the wall. "One." I called the law firm that handled my business matters. I'm an engineer by trade. I designed a couple of medical clamps that took off, which helped me build my own company and a nice income. Not a fortune, but we lived comfortably. "Ryder, Gordon, and Martin," the receptionist answered. "Hey, this is Arthur Piercy. Is Jameson Crane available?" I asked. "Please hold," she said, and I was left listening to generic elevator music. About 30 seconds later, someone picked up the line. "Mr. Piercy? Jonathan Ryder here." "Oh," I said, surprised. I was expecting Jerry. "Mr. Ryder, I've been arrested, and I need help." "Mr. Piercy," Ryder said, his voice dripping with regret, "I'm afraid our firm can't represent you. It's a conflict of interest." "Conflict of interest?" I snapped, anger rising. "You're my damn firm." "I'm sorry, Mr. Piercy. We can't help you." Then, just like that, the line went dead. I looked up, seeing the female officer standing by the cell door. "Get in," she ordered coldly. I was too stunned to argue, so I shuffled in, leg irons clinking as I moved. She slammed the door behind me without another word, then walked back to her desk, clearly trying to calm herself down. Hours passed before I was finally brought before a county commissioner to set my bail. It was here that I learned what I'd been accused of. Solicitation of a minor? I yelled, jumping to my feet. A heavy hand landed on my shoulder, forcing me back down. "What the hell?" I shouted, still reeling. "I would never do anything like that." "Sir," the commissioner said in a flat tone, "I'm not here to determine guilt or innocence, just to set bail. You're facing up to 10 years in prison and a $25,000 fine if convicted. Bail is set at $500,000. You can either post the full amount in cash or property, or you can hire a bail bondsman for 10%. If you can't post bail, you'll appear before a judge tomorrow for a bail review." Back at the precinct, I spent hours trying to reach someone, anyone, who could help. But when I tried calling Willow, my wife, her phone had been disconnected. No one at work answered. I had more than $600,000 in savings, and my house was fully paid off, so I figured I'd be able to cover the bail myself. There was no way I was going to fork over 50 grand to a bail bondsman for something that was clearly a mistake. I managed to get a little sleep before they woke me up for a barely edible breakfast in a box with a small bottle of orange juice. By the time I tried to make another call, another prisoner was already on the phone. Soon, they loaded me and a few others into a van and drove us to the courthouse. We were thrown into a holding cell in the basement until our hearings. "Piercy," an officer barked. "Someone's here to see you." "Yes," I said, walking toward the cell door. "Arthur Piercy?" A young woman's voice called out. "That's me," I replied. "You've been served," she said flatly. "Deputy." She handed over a stack of papers. "Mr. Piercy, this is a restraining order. You are hereby required to stay at least 500 feet away from Willow Piercy, Melanie Piercy, and Anthony Piercy. You are also to maintain the same distance from Willow's workplace and her residence. Additionally, this order covers the children's schools. Do you understand the terms?" I understood the words, but my mind was spinning. It didn't feel real. I vaguely remember signing the papers, my hands shaking. Opening the first envelope shattered any coherent thought I had left. Divorce papers. Limited divorce, to be precise. In this state, that's essentially a legal separation. A full divorce wouldn't be finalized until we lived apart for a full year. The restraining order? It had been drawn up the night before. I was numb. The realization hit me hard. I might never see Melanie or Tom again. Willow had set all of this in motion. I knew things between us had been rough, but this was beyond what I ever imagined. I met Willow during our junior year of college, back when my inventions were just ideas, and money was nothing but a distant hope. We married at 22, fresh out of school, and now, at 36, my life was imploding like a star-going supernova. Things took a turn for the worse at the bail review. The prosecutor gleefully added charges of possessing illicit images of children to the original accusation of resisting arrest. I shouted that I was innocent, that there was some massive mistake, but all I did was irritate the judge. Bail? Denied. I was sent to the county jail to await trial. Jail wasn't exactly a walk in the park. I got shoved, punched, and kicked more times than I could count. Honestly, I was lucky to be alive. They kept me locked up in isolation for most of the time, with a guard escorting me to the bathroom, which probably saved my life. I spent every waking moment calling lawyers, trying to scrape together a defense team. Divorce lawyers, trial lawyers, didn't matter. They all told me the same thing. Willow had already been to see them, so representing me would be a conflict of interest. Every door was slammed shut in my face. Then I found out my accounts had been emptied and closed. My business? My patents? Everything had been put in a trust for my kids by a family court judge after my arrest. The charges against me were splashed all over the media like a sick circus, and Willow used an old, but still valid, power of attorney to take my name off the deed to our house. I was broke, completely and utterly broke. The only money I had was the $52.26 that had been in my wallet when they arrested me. I did manage to scrounge up a couple of free lawyers, but they bolted the second the law firm of Ryder, Gordon, and Martin showed them the gravity of the situation. It didn't help that no one wanted to be associated with someone branded as a predator. So I sat there, rotting in jail, cursing the system and every person who had abandoned me. After a month, my court date finally arrived. It was a total joke. I met my public defender, some fresh-faced kid who looked barely old enough to shave, just 30 minutes before the trial started. He glanced over the charges and evidence and said, in the nicest possible way, that I was screwed. The prosecution laid it out. I had allegedly groomed a 13-year-old girl online, someone they called Jane Donovan. They claimed I tried to get her to meet up for something indecent. She had supposedly told her mother, who then reported it to the police. The girl was apparently so traumatized that the judge excused her from testifying in person. They had 162 images of underage girls supposedly found on my computer and a flash drive they claimed I hid in my sock drawer. I pleaded not guilty, but none of it mattered. The jury saw me as guilty. The judge sentenced me to 10 years, but because it was my first offense, he suspended 5 years of the sentence. The sentence for possessing the images ran concurrently with the solicitation charge. And to top it all off, I was ordered to undergo psychiatric counseling and was placed on the sex offender registry. Saying I was scared out of my mind would be an understatement. All I had was time in the county jail, so I focused on working out, trying to make myself stronger. Even though I had built up some muscle, I knew the next 5 years in prison were going to be hell. When I arrived at the state penitentiary, they gave me an orange jumpsuit and marched me to my new home, a cell block that would be my world for a long time. One day, I was sitting at a table in the block, trying to write a letter to Melanie and Tom. I had written to them every other day while I was locked up, but they never wrote back. Willow never brought them to visit. No friends showed up. It was as if the world had erased me. While I was writing, an older guy, around 60 with a white goatee, sat down across from me. He stared at me, tilting his head like I was some sort of puzzle. "I don't see it," he finally said. Confused, I looked behind me, thinking maybe he was talking to someone else. "See what? What's so special about you?" he replied, his voice skeptical. "Before you showed up, a lawyer came in, a bald-headed pissant. He promised free legal help to the Aryans, the blacks, the Asians, even those MS-13 crazies, as long as they left you alone. Hell, even the warden came down to tell us to stay away from you. So, what makes you so important?" I had no idea what he was talking about, but I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The only bald lawyer I knew was Jameson Crane. I extended my hand. "Arthur Piercy." He didn't shake it, just stared at me. "I know who you are. Now, tell me your story." So I did. I laid everything out. My arrest, my wife, my kids, losing everything I had. I explained that I had no clue where all the so-called evidence against me came from. I was supposed to be a normal guy, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Supposed to be?" he asked. "I'm guilty, according to the court," I muttered. "But anyone who hurts kids like that deserves to have their manhood cut off and shoved up their own ass." He raised an eyebrow, giving me a long look. "You know, I almost believe you."
I'm Mason Berenten.
Lifer. The next 3 years weren't easy, but I survived. Barrington wasn't my friend, but being associated with him kept me safer than I would have been on my own. I got punched, shoved into walls, but that was par for the course when you're a loner. As someone labeled a predator, I couldn't join any gang, couldn't mix with the general population. That's what they call the regular criminals, thieves, muggers, the usual. But even with all that, I was still better off than the real child molesters. 3 of them died, and another was left a quadriplegic. Nobody came to visit me. I got letters from my parents, but they were more like reminders of how much I disappointed them. They still cared enough to write, but they couldn't reconcile what I'd been accused of. My brother and sister, they cut me off completely, slapping me with restraining orders to keep me away from them and their families. I'd heard through the prison grapevine that Jameson Crane had been showing up 2 or 3 times a month, offering free legal help to some of the inmates. Rumor had it, every time he came, he met with the warden to check up on me. After spending a month wallowing in self-pity, Jameson sent a message. One day, a guy grabbed me and slammed me into the wall, holding me there while Jerry's words were delivered. Miss your kids? Tough luck. Get over it. Angry at your situation? Get over it. Feeling sorry for yourself because life sucks? Get over it. You're making yourself a target, and that needs to stop. It was harsh, but I listened. I got serious about working out, started learning self-defense. After that, most of the bullying let up. I hit the books, spending time in the prison library and even teaching a few classes in engineering. Then, exactly a year after my arrest, Willow divorced me. The papers were handed to me right after the hearing. She'd gotten a feminist, no-nonsense judge who threw the book at me. The alimony and child support payments were based on the income I'd been making back when I still owned my business and patents. But since I was a felon in prison, the judge decided I didn't need any of that money. My assets were forfeited. What really broke me, though, was the ruling that, as a registered sex offender, I was barred from any contact or visitation with my kids. To top it off, the judge ordered that if I ever got out, my wages would be garnished. 2 days after the divorce, I got roughed up again, this time by 2 massive inmates. Barrington stood nearby, watching. "Now that I've got your attention," he said. "Lose the attitude. You got screwed over in that divorce. Worse than anyone I've ever seen. But that anger is leaking out, and you're starting to piss people off. What did I tell you when you first got here? I need to survive." I muttered, bruised and winded. "Exactly. That advice goes for both in here and out there. Let me clue you in on something. This prison is overcrowded. They're letting non-violent prisoners out early to make room. You're up for parole next year if you can keep your head down and make it." I survived just barely. A new inmate who had been abused as a kid stabbed me. But I lived. Eventually, I got paroled. Now, if you think I was going to get my revenge, think again. Try getting revenge when you're a registered sex offender living in a halfway house, with the only job available being a night shift janitor at an office building. My degrees didn't mean squat with that label hanging over me. Before I got out, Barrington came through for me one last time. He let me know that Willow had remarried. Her new husband was Stanley Hogarth, soon to be a partner at Ryder, Gordon, and Martin. A carton of cigarettes bought me their new address. 2 days after my release, I found myself sitting in a park across from their condo. I just finished my shift when I saw Tom, now 13, step out of the building. He'd grown at least 8 inches and had shed all his baby fat. He looked so skinny, almost unrecognizable. Melanie was unmistakable, though. At 15, with her long brunette hair flowing down her back, she was the spitting image of Willow. They climbed into a small white bus, and as they drove off, I wiped away the tears. That became my routine, showing up every morning just to see them get on the bus to their private school. For months into my stay at the halfway house, 2 parolees tried to beat me down for being a pervert. I sent them both to the hospital and got kicked out of the house. Fortunately, a guy I'd helped before vouched for me when my parole officer showed up to investigate. I managed to keep my job but had to live on the streets, bouncing between shelters and soup kitchens. My meals were often subsidized by food stamps. As for getting a gun or drinking myself into oblivion, well, even the cheapest gun was out of my reach, and alcohol or suicide. I considered it. But in the end, I remembered I needed to survive. The only thing that kept me going was those brief moments when I saw my kids. That 10 to 15-second glimpse of them every morning was my lifeline. It gave me the strength to carry on. I knew plenty of people would love to see me back in prison, but I was determined not to give them the satisfaction. Days turned into weeks, weeks became years. Early on, I tried to get the divorce ruling changed with a pro bono lawyer's help. But Jonathan Ryder crushed him so thoroughly that he had to leave the state. No one else would touch my appeal after that. During one of my mandatory check-ins, my parole officer warned me that a private investigator had been snooping around, asking questions about me. Suddenly, I was glad to be homeless. No fixed address made me harder to find. I shifted my routine, watching my kids from different spots, sometimes catching only a fleeting glance as they were driven to and from places. More often than not, I watched them play in the park with their friends. I was always careful to keep my distance and not get too close. Violating the restraining order could land me right back in prison. One fall day, when Tom was a high school senior and Melanie had just left for her first year at Harvard, I was sitting on my usual bench in the park, watching Tom as he made his way to the school bus. He stopped in his tracks and looked my way. He stared for a moment before giving me a small, tentative wave. I was stunned. There was no way he could have recognized me. I still worked out, had lost at least 40 pounds since my arrest, and wore a full beard. I even cut my own hair to save money. I looked scruffy, but it was enough to blend in. The office building manager let me use the restroom to clean up after my shifts, and I made sure to look decent enough to avoid complaints. For the rest of the school year, Tom would occasionally wave to me. I knew he didn't recognize me as his father, just as some familiar guy sitting alone in the park every morning. But then, one day, something happened that shook me to my core. "Hey, mister, mind if I join you?" Tom's voice startled me as he suddenly appeared beside my bench. I hadn't even seen him approach. Panic set in. I scanned the area for Willow or cops, but we were alone. Tom looked upset, so I nodded for him to sit. "You seem down," I said, trying to sound gruff to disguise my voice. "Girl problems." "How'd you know?" Tom asked, surprised. I chuckled softly. "No disrespect, but at your age, that's what it is 90% of the time." "My girl and I broke up," he muttered. "She doesn't like that. I've been seeing other girls. My dad says not to worry. There are plenty of fish in the sea, but I cared about her." "Want my opinion? Even though you probably won't like it?" I asked. "Why should I care what you think?" Tom shot back, defensive. "Because you're standing here, talking to me about it instead of going to your mother or father," I replied, looking Tom in the eye. He seemed to crumble at that, his shoulders slumping. "Dad keeps saying that a man doesn't need to listen to women," Tom muttered. "They're only good for one thing. A man's gotta be a man. Mom barely talks to me." I nodded slowly, taking in his words. "A man does need to be a man, but he's judged by his actions and how he treats people, especially those who trust him." "Were you and that girl exclusive?" Tom hesitated, mumbling, "She thought we were." "But you weren't," I finished. "She trusted you and you broke that trust. That had to hurt her." Tom shot up from the bench, clearly upset. "I warned you," I said, holding my hand up. "You weren't going to like what I had to say. But the truth is, you lost her love and trust. And respect, Tom, respect is everything. Both giving it and earning it." "My dad has respect from others," Tom said, almost defiantly. "Think about what you just said." I urged him. "Why don't you pick up a couple of Louis L'Amour books? Pay attention to how the characters act. You won't go wrong following a good example." "What about my girl?" he asked, his voice softening. "Did you treat her right?" I asked, my gaze steady on him. Tom hung his head and shook it slowly. "Read those books," I told him. "You'll figure it out." A week passed, and one morning I found a book on my bench, The Writer of Lost Creek. Inside, Tom had left a note. He'd apologized to the girl, but she hadn't taken him back. He admitted it was all his fault and said he was working on bettering himself. Time moved quickly after that. Tom left for Johns Hopkins University, and my sightings of him and Melanie became rare. Still, I showed up every morning at the park. That routine had become too ingrained in me to stop. Dating was out of the question. I was still on the sex offenders registry. Money was tight, most of it withheld for child support and alimony, and I knew better than to try and fight it. I never saw Willow or her husband, Stanley, but every now and then, I'd catch a fleeting glimpse of Melanie or Tom when they visited the condo. The year I turned 50 was when things took a bad turn. I got caught outside during a freezing rainstorm. I was soaked and shivering, but I still had to walk to work. By the time I left for the day, I was sweating and freezing at the same time, barely able to breathe from a hacking cough. My head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. Somehow, I ended up sitting on the park bench, snow piling up around me. I saw Tom walking out of the condo, and he waved at me. I tried to wave back, but my arm barely lifted before I collapsed onto the ground. "Hey, mister, you okay?" Tom's voice sounded distant as I struggled to focus. He knelt beside me, concern on his face. "Shit, you're burning up. We've got to get you inside." Tom somehow pulled me to my feet, and as we started walking, I pointed weakly to the cart I always used. "We'll get it later," he said firmly. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at the man he'd become, just before another coughing fit nearly brought me to my knees. "What's going on, Mr. Hoggarth?" the doorman asked as we stumbled into the building. "Call an ambulance," Tom ordered. "He's soaked through. Do we have any towels or blankets?" "There's a blanket in the closet," the doorman replied, rushing off to get it. Tom laid me down on the carpet just as I heard the unmistakable sound of high heels clicking across the floor. A feminine voice spoke, sharp and familiar. "Robert, what are you doing with that man?" "It's the old guy from the park," Tom explained, barely looking up. "He collapsed. I think he's homeless. He's burning up with fever." I blinked as the room spun, and there she was, Willow, looking down at me. I gasped, barely able to whisper, "Willow, that would be my mother," came the cautious reply. "Do we know you?" "They're asking if he has any ID," the doorman said, covering the mouthpiece of his phone. "Hang on," Tom said, patting down my janitor's uniform despite his sister's protests. "Robert," Melanie's voice rang out, sharp with panic. "Don't touch him. You don't know what he might have. There could be needles." "Get a grip, sis," Tom scoffed. "His hair is cut, his uniform's clean." "Ah, here it is." He pulled out my security badge and froze, his face draining of color. Suddenly, I realized how close I was to being found out. I needed to get away, but my body refused to cooperate. I rolled onto my side, coughing so hard I could barely see straight, the room spinning around me. Melanie snatched the badge out of Tom's hand, her face contorting in fury. The next thing I knew, she was shaking me by the lapels like a rag doll. "You bastard!" she screamed. "How dare you show your face here? Why aren't you dead? You abandoned us. You left us." "Didn't want to, baby girl," I gasped. "Was forced to." And then everything went black. For weeks later, Willow Hoggarth walked briskly off the elevator on the 30th floor of the prestigious law firm of Ryder, Gordon, and Martin. She looked every bit the part of a woman who had it all, jewels sparkling, wrapped in a long black gown that hugged her figure like it had in college, save for the extra curves motherhood had added. It was just before 7 in the evening, and while a few associates and paralegals were still scurrying about, the reception desk was empty. Annoyed, Willow huffed and adjusted the wrap on her shoulders. She motioned for her bodyguard to stay where he was and headed down the hall. As she passed by the ornate mirrors, she smiled at her reflection, pleased with what she saw. Reaching the common area where the associate cubicles were, she noticed one light still on. Frowning, she made her way over. "Melanie, you're not even dressed yet," Willow scolded. "You know how important this dedication is for your father. It's another big step toward him becoming a named partner." Melanie barely looked up from the stack of papers she was working through. "Mother," she said calmly, "I asked you here under the pretense of needing a ride to the dedication. I actually wanted to ask you something." Willow's frown deepened. "What is it? What really happened?" Melanie asked, her voice steady. "What do you mean, what happened?" Willow asked, visibly confused. "What really happened to my biological father?" Melanie asked again. Willow's eyes widened, and she drew in a sharp breath, her face twisting with anger. "I told you, I will not discuss that person." Melanie stood quickly, stepping in front of her mother. "Mother, it's been 14 years. I know what he was convicted of. I know he got a 10-year sentence. But I'm your daughter, not your lawyer. I want to know the truth." "The truth?" Willow's voice shook with fury. "The truth is that man tried to seduce a 13-year-old girl. He never wrote to you or your brother, never called. He abandoned all of us. All of us," Melanie repeated flatly, pulling some papers from her desk. "Sit down, Mother. Let's take a look at what he was really accused of." "Take a look at what?" Willow asked, her voice sharp with impatience. "Let's start with the solicitation emails," Melanie replied, undeterred. "There are 24 in total, 16 from my biological father and 8 from that girl. The contents are graphic enough to justify a charge of solicitation. So, there's his conviction, right? Seems clear enough. Willow nodded, eager to move on. Exactly. His conviction was justified. Now, can we stop this nonsense and head to the dedication? But Melanie continued as if her mother hadn't spoken. The problem I found was with the dates of those emails. 8 of the 16 emails supposedly sent by my father were sent when he was in Houston, presenting at a medical conference. I checked. He was there the entire time. Willow waved a hand dismissively. He could have sent them from his laptop or phone. We don't need to dredge all this up again. He couldn't have sent them from his laptop or phone, Melanie said firmly, a puzzled look crossing her face. All 16 emails were sent from our home computer. So, who sent them? Willow opened her mouth to speak, but Melanie raised a hand to stop her. As a matter of fact, Melanie continued, 2 of the emails were sent while he was in Houston, and you had taken Tom and me to summer camp. Willow fell silent, her mouth pressing into a thin line. Melanie pressed on. And what about the girl? She never testified in court. I can't even find her name in any police report or any proof that the police interviewed her at all. I know juvenile records are sealed, but there should have been something to show they contacted her family. Willow shifted uncomfortably, but Melanie wasn't done. And those illicit baby pictures? They were all downloaded to our home computer on a single day, within 15 minutes. And on that day, Dad was at work. Security tapes from his office confirmed it. These are all things that should have come up in his trial, Melanie added, her voice rising with frustration. But he got stuck with a brand new, overwhelmed public defender. Melanie, leave it alone, Willow pleaded, her voice tight. Why should I? Melanie asked, her tone steely. It's been 14 years, Mom. I just want to know what really happened. There's nothing we can do to change the past, Willow replied, shaking her head. I'm not looking to change the past, Melanie insisted. I just want the truth. I remember you and Daddy Dearest Stanley hanging all over each other at those parties. You'd both disappear for a while. Tom and I saw it and we didn't like it. We were too young to understand or speak up. Why do you think we never warmed up to him? Willow's eyes widened, but she stayed silent as Melanie continued. I also found out the hall for your and Stanley's wedding reception was reserved a month before Dad's arrest. How did you find that out? Willow gasped, her voice cracking. You deleted your emails, but I only needed to make one phone call to check the records for the hall, Melanie explained. Dad had started looking into hiring a private investigator. That's why you and Stanley did it, isn't it? Willow slumped into a chair, her shoulders sagging. That man was sitting on a gold mine, and he wouldn't maximize the potential of his patents no matter how much I begged him. Stanley and I started talking about it one day at work. He was an associate, I was a paralegal. We just understood each other. We planned everything out and, well, Stanley and I were much more compatible than your father and I ever were. Willow shot her daughter a sardonic look, then hesitated, a flash of unease crossing her face. We wanted to secure your and Tom's future. The way Arthur set everything up with his business and patents was a disaster waiting to happen. My brother's name was Tom before you changed it to Robert Hogarth, Melanie said, her tone icy. Yes, we couldn't have any association with that man's name, Willow snapped back. It took years for friends and family to believe we had nothing to do with his actions. We did everything for you and your brother. Stanley adopted both of you, and we sent you to the best schools. Melanie let out a derisive snort. Stanley adopted us because the patents and the business were put in an unbreakable trust for Tom and me. Weeks before Dad was arrested. Neither of us was encouraged to take an interest in his company. But I remember everything. After Dad's arrest, we moved out of the old house into Stanley's condo. For 2 months, Tom and I took the bus to a rundown, overcrowded public school. Melanie leaned forward, her voice filled with disdain. One day, you and Mrs. Gordon came back from shopping, and she asked us how we liked our new school. I told her how awful it was, and she said something I'll never forget. She told you that, as the wife of a new partner, you should be more mindful of how the schools we attended reflected on Stanley's standing in the firm. The next day, you enrolled us at Brightwood Academy. That must have cost a fortune, Willow replied, trying to maintain her composure. It takes time to get into those types of schools. Yes, Melanie shot back. And that was also the year you and Stanley were off jet-setting around the world, leaving Tom and me behind with a part-time housekeeper. At least she kept the fridge stocked. You two were never home. Those trips were necessary to build Stanley's client base, Willow replied defensively. I'm sorry if you felt neglected, but I had to distance myself from that man's crimes. You were children, so it didn't affect you the same way. It would have, Melanie countered. If Stanley hadn't adopted us and changed our names so quickly, there were a million questions at Brightwood. Rumors spread like wildfire. That year on our own taught Tom and me to be self-reliant and suspicious of attachments. It's probably why neither of us has had a serious relationship. Melanie's voice softened as she continued. I got into Harvard and then Harvard Law on my own merits, with scholarships I earned. Tom did the same at Hopkins. You know, Tom and I might have never uncovered the truth about the trust if it weren't for a stroke of luck, Melanie said, her tone sharpening. Willow's face paled slightly. What do you mean? She asked nervously. We met someone, Melanie explained. After that, we started digging. We found the divorce decree and the restraining order. Those documents made Tom and me suspicious about the business, so we started looking deeper into everything. Did you know that the district attorney personally assigned that public defender to handle my father's case? It turns out the firm and the business contributed heavily to his gubernatorial campaign, both legally and under the table. Willow's lips thinned, but she said nothing. Melanie pressed on. Clyde Murphy, the general manager of the business, was promoted to CEO with a non-voting share of stock. He raised prices to 8 times what they'd been before, and from what I saw in your emails, he reports directly to you. Willow's expression didn't change, but Melanie wasn't finished. The old house, everything in it, sold. The money, along with all the savings and investments, was funneled into buying Stanley's junior partnership, with the promise he'd be made full partner in 4 years. We found the letter of agreement, along with another letter confirming Ryder, Gordon, and Martin as the business's sole law firm for the next 40 years. The retainer fee they're charging? It's astronomical, way more than the business ever paid for legal services before. Willow shifted in her chair, her eyes narrowing. And imagine our surprise, Melanie continued, when Tom and I discovered that you, Stanley, and Jonathan Ryder were the executors of our trust. Yet, Tom and I haven't seen a single cent of that money. Willow stood up, looking down at her daughter with a condescending smile. This trip down memory lane has been very revealing, but it's all in the past, she said coldly. I have a dedication to get to, and I see you won't be coming with me. We've all done things that weren't entirely legal, but it was to secure our future. Your father wouldn't listen. He had to be removed from the picture. Tomorrow, Stanley, Jonathan, and I will sit down with you and Robert to discuss it. Until then, don't do anything foolish. Jeopardize myself? Melanie replied, incredulously. Did you ever wonder why I put a deadbolt on my bedroom door? It was to keep Stanley out. Willow's face remained impassive, but her eyes flickered with something like fear. The first night he came into my room, he was naked, climbing onto my bed. Melanie continued, her voice shaking. Tom followed him in and hit him between the legs with his lightsaber. It's a shame it wasn't a real one. That must have been a bad dream, Willow said, her voice tight. Don't say anything you'll regret. My only regret, Melanie said, her voice rising, is that I didn't do this sooner. Hopscotch. At the sound of the word, 2 men and a woman emerged from an office nearby, and Melanie gestured toward them. Mommy dearest, meet agents from the FBI. Since the governor is involved, we couldn't trust the state authorities. Willow's mouth fell open, but no words came out. You've confessed to fabricating evidence, and it's all been recorded, Melanie said. This office is filled with signs about electronic surveillance. By now, Stanley, Jonathan Ryder, and Clyde Murphy have been arrested. So have the parents of that 13-year-old girl you paid $75,000 to manufacture those emails. Willow stumbled back into her chair, her face ashen. Do you remember Mia, Dad's personal assistant? The one you had fired? Melanie asked. Well, she never trusted Clyde. She's been quietly keeping track of the business for years. She, Tom, and our new CEO have spent the last 2 weeks going through the books. Jameson Crane is doing the same here, on orders from the IRS. Willow looked like she might faint, but Melanie continued. In short, we've shut down all the offshore accounts where you were funneling money from the business. The trust and business accounts are now under strict control. Tom and I closed all our personal accounts and opened new ones. Even the safety deposit boxes set up in our names have been emptied, all under the FBI's watch. Willow sat in stunned silence as Melanie picked up a piece of paper from her desk and handed it to her. This is a court order, Melanie said, stating that I have to return all your personal property to the condo for inventory. So, I'll need your necklace, earrings, and purse. Willow didn't move until the female FBI agent nudged her. Reluctantly, she took off her jewelry and handed it to Melanie, who placed it in the purse. You sent a good man to prison and turned him into a monster, all to get rich, Melanie spat. You took my father away from me for 14 years. According to a convict named Mason Barrington, my father wrote to Tom and me every day. We never got a single one. I wonder where all the letters I sent him ended up. Willow looked away, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. It doesn't matter now, Melanie said, her tone hardening. Dad's been appointed the new CEO of his company. Thanks to you, he's had years to develop new products, and we're filing patents for them. His appointment and your arrests are already all over the media. Congressmen and senators are petitioning the president for his pardon. Melanie picked up an envelope from her desk and handed it to her mother. Congratulations, Mom. You're about to become the most hated woman in the world. Willow didn't reach for the envelope, so Melanie dropped it in her lap. I decided to be generous. In that envelope is a gift from me to you, $52.26. That's the exact amount of money Dad had when you sent him to prison. Spend it wisely. It's the only thing you'll ever get from me or Tom.